Hello, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my series about the Northern Irish Troubles. Rounding up, this is the assessment section, and I talked about those who deserve credit because it's a poignant tale, the Troubles, and a lot of people don't come out of it looking good. But I already paid tribute to John Hume. In '97, some people hoped he'd stand for the presidency of Ireland. However, he felt the peace process needed his full dedication. I was hoping to go for it this coming November, but unfortunately, he's 80 years old, he's got dementia. Anyway, he got the Nobel Prize, and he deserved to be a Nobel laureate. David Trimble collected it as well. So Trimble was very much disapproved by many nationalists because of his stand over Drumcree. And by '98, he would not have been welcome there with Orangemen at Drumcree. There was a member of the Orange Order because of his signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So when people were killed by the Omagh bomb, he went to the funeral of a Catholic child in Buncrana, County Donegal. Some Orangemen suggested he be expelled from the Orange Order for doing so, because one of the rules of the Orange Order is not to countenance the fatal errors of the Church of Rome by attending their worship. That's the wording used in one of their official documents. It seems archaic, but it was written in the early 19th century. So he went out on a limb to make life better. There is a scintillating book called Unionist Politics, published in 1998, and it observes that no Unionist leader has ever been booted out by his party for being too uncompromising, though several have been kicked out for being too accommodating to nationalism, and the same was to happen to Trimble. Eventually lost his seat in Upper Ban, even left the party. He's in the Conservative Party these days. He's a peer. So the Alliance Party, they deserve to be adulated because they took a considered view of things. They're very restrained. They preached reconciliation. They were pro-union, perhaps not unionist as such. They had nothing to do with the loyal orders, and they really tried to improve community relations. So they were modern and reasonable, only got about 10% of the vote. So they weren't banging a drum or they weren't waving a flag or anything like that, and they certainly had no truck with terrorist organisations on either side. So some politicians from the Republic of Ireland merit an honourable mention, such as Jack Lynch, and things are very difficult for him to try and close down the Provisional IRA when there was considerable sympathy in the South for the IRA, and he was abused as Union Jack by some members of his own party. So Liam Cosgrave, he did Trojan work as well, went as far as he could. Likewise, Dr. Fitzgerald. So let me see. Well, how about London politicians? Well, Edward Heath, he was inconsistent. You know, he jumped between repression of terrorism and then conciliation, inviting the IRA to talks. Now, perhaps those truces did sow divisions within the IRA and allow intelligence to be gathered. Were they entered into in good faith by the Heath government? It's debatable. So Wilson and Callaghan had pushed for reform in the 60s. I mean, until 1968, Northern Ireland was really not on the radar of Westminster politicians. It was almost never mentioned. There was a convention that Northern Irish matters were dealt with in Stormont. That was it, because it was a devolved government. And some Labour parties members got involved in the campaign for democracy in Ulster, I think it was called. They were sympathetic to Irish nationalism. The Nationalist Party said there's a lot of discrimination. We've got to do something about it. And then there were street protests in 1968 and so on, which could not be ignored. So Thatcher's unwavering stance against the Provisional IRA was commendable, was consistent, but she was sometimes intransigent. Her tone was perhaps a bit too shrill. She worked to foster more cordial relationships between the UK and the Irish Republic. So the Garda Síochána, they deserve to be exalted for gallantly doing their duty, even when it was unpopular, even when they suffered bitter insults, and almost all of them would be nationalists of some stripe or another. So they did a lot to close down the Provisional IRA, particularly as time went on, and they rotated serving up on the border, because on the border, people weren't stationed there permanently. They were, serving in other counties before they had to go up there. And I remember meeting an ex-guard, and he said, I was involved in arrests of IRA men, and I'm definitely a nationalist, and I believe Ireland should be one, but it's got to be by constitutional means, by persuasion and all that. So he did this with a clear conscience, despite being an outspoken nationalist. So anyway, I could discuss a bit later things which ought to have been done better. There was obviously courage on the part of all sorts of people. And courage does not mean morality. There's this myth that bravery and cruelty have to be opposites. They can go together, or indeed someone could be very humane and also very cowardly as well. Those who are psychopaths are indifferent to suffering, including their own suffering. And then some people who are frightened of violence could also be very good in helping other people and perhaps self-sacrificing in other ways. You could be a terrorist on either side and also be physically brave. You look at the hunger strikers, they were willing to die for their cause. There's no question that they were devoted to it. And it was a cold courage. They weren't being brave in the heat of combat. They're willing to die for about 10 weeks with many, many chances to change their mind. But no, they did it, and their cause could still be terrible. Every cause, good or wicked, has been served by courageous people, and so on. So the RUC obviously deserves to be commended. That's why they got the George Cross. Now, I know there were some bad RUC men. Some were evil and murdered people for their religious denomination, but that's a very, very few. And unfortunately, there's an excessive focus on the few bad apples. And I know, as the Hunt report revealed, a few RUC officers were a disgrace to the uniform in 1969 and joining loyalist mobs to burn out Catholic families and things like that. When I say burn out, not to kill them, but to force them out of their houses by intimidation, which is still dreadful. And obviously, there were soldiers in the army who were good, morally good as well as brave. And, I don't have an overly high opinion of armies in general. Some soldiers are petty thugs, get a kick out of bullying people. So I don't dismiss all accusations out of hand, and some of them well documented. Dr. Joe Hendren was a GP in West Belfast, and he documented some injuries sustained on some of his patients by the British Army, as in being kicked and punched and so on, including IRE detainees. Now, some of these might be reasonable when the person was resisting arrest or something like that, other times not. I had a colleague from Strabane, and he recalled how in the 90s, going home from school, some soldiers slightly older than himself would stop him and tip out his school bag in a contemptible act of petty bullying. I don't think that typifies the behaviour of the British Army, but I will certainly accept that sometimes it was worthy only of disdain. There was brutality on occasion. So a lot could have been done to make the situation better. Jack Lynch had one of the best suggestions which wasn't followed up, but perhaps UN troops, perhaps it wasn't severe enough for that to happen. 3,500 people killed in the end. I know it seems horrific. I mean, obviously nobody should meet a violent death. There's violence in every society, and the rate of violence in Northern Ireland was not particularly high, particularly after the early 70s. There was huge media focus on it because it was such an easy place to report, with a completely free press. Just shows what liberty there was within the United Kingdom. Nobody was censored, and people were allowed to castigate the British Army, the RUC, as much as they wanted to. Journalists could go anywhere. The IRA were very media savvy right from the beginning, were canny enough to curry favour with journalists and give them access and juicy interviews, even bring them on so-called operations when there was actually no firing, including journalists from Great Britain, BBC journalists. And they even took over this town of Carrickmore in 1979 for the BBC to demonstrate how potent they were. The loyalists were not so wise in getting on the right side of journalists. And as I said, a New York Times journalist who was in Northern Ireland in the 70s and made this observation, and he had long hair, as was typical at the time, and the IRA thought, well, maybe you're an undercover soldier trying a bit too hard to hide the fact you're a soldier, growing your hair long. Remember being the 70s, being the decade of long hair. But if a journalist had short hair, well, then maybe he was a soldier, so just couldn't win. Notably, only one journalist was ever murdered in the whole conflict. That was, what was his name? Martin O'Hagan, right at the end. And he was a former official IRA man, but he later renounced republicanism and tried to be as even-handed as he could be, killed by the LVF because he exposed their drug-dealing activity. So that was quite staggering, and obviously commendable that journalists weren't targeted. What else can I say? The idea of repartition perhaps actually been explored in more depth because there were some areas where a high majority of people wanted to join the Republic of Ireland, and that was examined by the Heath government, certainly again by the Thatcher government. Derry west of the Foyle, we're certainly outside the walls of Derry, that would be a good idea. Maybe some of South Armagh, maybe the whole of County Fermanagh, areas of Tyrone, certainly Strabane, and so on. However, that would be a huge financial burden on the Republic of Ireland. Bear in mind, we were economically struggling in the early 70s. We were one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. Our economy was closer to that of an Eastern European economy than that of Great Britain. The wealth gap was very considerable. That's why we had mass emigration. So we would have had to financially support all those people from the north who would then be part of the Republic. And that could even have collapsed our economy, which was quite close to it. Charlie Haughey said at the time we'd been living far beyond our means. But there we are. Perhaps the Republic of Ireland could have even been subsidised by the UK to take this. The argument against repartition is that the IRAs is that bit closer to Belfast, and what else? It would be a psychological boost to whoever. What do you do about the large nationalist enclave in West Belfast and so on? Now, no border can ever be drawn where everybody on one side of it wants to belong to that country and everybody the other wants to belong to the other country. Borders are imperfect. There's the absolutist fallacy. Well, why should the border be here and not an inch this way or that? Line has to be drawn somewhere in space as well as in time. But that was one of the many possible solutions which could have improved the situation a little bit, but in the end was not implemented.